Thank you for coming out tonight. We're glad to have you here tonight to listen to Richard Saunders, our featured guest. I just wanted to give a brief introduction to him. Really, my dad should be the one that's giving this presentation because he goes way back with Richard. And long way back. And knew him really well. And I've been lucky enough to know him over the years, but not nearly as well. But Richard actually, the way my dad would put it, was employed here in 1990 and may have done some work as well. But you were here for, that was before we moved into this location. That was at the original Benchmark Books down on Rio Grande Street. And I remember one of our secretaries that has now passed away, but had when we had her retirement party. How long ago was that?
Oh, 5 years ago or more?
We compiled a list of former employees, and Richard here was right there as one of those that worked with us way back when. So we're grateful to have him here once again. Now, in my time at Benchmark Books, which has been the last 21 years, I know we've held 2 other events for you. Has it been more than 2?
Don't think so.
Okay, so this is now his 3rd author signing in the last, it's probably only been in the last 10 or 15 years. So a very accomplished author, he's done a lot of things, and he's a very big book guy. Case in point, I'm out of these, so I don't know if you have any more, but he created a little pamphlet called Collectible Mormon Books of the 20th Century, a short list of titles in English. Great little reference for you if you're building a book collection. A lot of these are ones that you ought to have. Just as an example, number 1 is the Hourback Catalogs. List of works relating to Mormons from the New York Public Library, a Mormon bibliography, Chad Flake. These are the kinds of things that really start many book collections, and I would encourage you to seek out a copy and start your collections or add to your collections if you don't already have them. As you may or may not know, Richard is probably the single biggest resident expert on Dale Morgan, early writer of Mormonism and mostly Western Americana. And he put out a bibliography of the published works of Dale Morgan in 1990. Now, how many were done in a dust jacket?
54, I think. 54, 56.
So now there's a book guy for you. I have copies of the original available. Nice linen boards. No dust jacket, $50. Copies and jackets, I honestly have not seen one for sale in many years, but this is out of my father's library. I know Joe's got one. Who else has a copy and a jacket? Greg? Not even Greg?
You kept one.
I kept one.
Okay.
I kept 2.
So, very fun little book thing there. In going along with Dale Morgan, and I'm sad to say we don't have any copies of this for sale currently, but volumes 13 and 14 in the Kingdom in the West are on the collected works of Dale Morgan, on his Mormon works, parts 1 and 2, that make up part of the 16-volume set. Many years ago, published another great book, Printing in Deseret, covering the years 1849 to 1851. Talking about the earliest things published here in Utah. Anybody have anything in this book in their collection? Greg, what do you got?
I got several of the territorial printing of
Okay,
laws.
early territorial.
And
Joe, nothing? No? I'm sure you do.
No, I
Nothing
actually
in there?
don't. Mm-mm.
Your wife says you do, so
What do we
maybe
have?
she's holding out on you.
She's hoping maybe.
And then we come to the books that he has just recently authored. For several of you, last night we had a wonderful gathering at the Alta Club where he talked to the Utah Bibliographic Society, which if any of you here would be interested in joining, is taking members, and it's a great organization that gets together once or twice a year and hears from an expert on some interesting topic related to books or publishing. And we'd love to have you join. But anyway, this is Reams in the Desert, Paper Making in Utah, 1849 to 1893. Very interesting. He gave a great presentation last night about the history of paper making in Utah. We have copies of this available tonight if you like at $25. And then the focus of tonight's meeting, the 1920 edition of the Book of Mormon, a Centennial Adventure in Latter-day Saint book history. I love that. This is Richard Leopold Saunders. I'm going to say that's his middle name.
Fair enough.
This is your what? 12th book?
I don't think if you count the genealogy stuff, it's probably like number 15 or something like that.
15 books, that's pretty
Nobody reads
impressive.
my genealogy, except family.
So anyway, we're grateful to have him here tonight. Before we jump into him speaking to us, I did just want to mention, if you need to use the restroom, there are some down the hall here. If you buy a book from me first, I'll give you the code. No. It's 254 to get in the restrooms. There will be some refreshments in the hallway afterwards you're welcome to have. And unfortunately, in the world of Mormon books right now, there's not much to look forward to. But we are planning an event the second week of May with the next book from Signature Books, which is a biography of Susie Young Gates, written by one of her descendants' husbands. So,
his wife.
yeah, the author's wife is
Yeah,
a descendant of.
I'm sorry.
So that'll be coming up the
Sorry.
second week of May. If you're interested, and we'll get an announcement out about that. Outside of that, there's really not much coming out anytime soon, unless
Well,
Greg
Writing
Kofford
Mormon
has
History
something-
2 is coming out just down the road a ways.
what's that?
Writing Mormon History 2 is coming
Okay.
out. It's just down the road a ways.
Down the road a little ways, yeah, for sure. Another very important book coming from Greg Kofford Books, and we appreciate you being here tonight. And by the way, Greg brought many books from his personal collection that are in the case tonight if you want to take a look, that are editions of the 1920 or shortly thereafter, to give you a better context of why this book was done. But anyway, they've got a book coming officially in August still, okay? Which will be really the best thing ever done, in my guesstimate, on Mormons and Masonry and the extent that Masonry played in influencing the way Joseph Smith did things in early Mormonism. That's called Method Infinite, scheduled for an August release. So,
Could I just make one comment?
Sure.
It was, Kofford Books was kind enough to allow me to write the blurb on it, so I got to read it. It is amazing. I think in my blurb, Lloyd can correct me, but I said it actually opened up a whole new world to me. It was like, as I read it, I was like being opened into this new world that I'd never, it's good. It's
Cool.
really good.
I love that. That's awesome. By the way, we have a special guest, Joe Geisner, here that just spoke. He's visiting from California, and he edited a wonderful collection of books from Signature Books. If you don't have, that he was mentioning, called Writing Mormon History, Historians and Their Books. I would highly recommend, if you don't have, to check out his book and get it signed tonight. All right, well, without further ado then, I turn the time over to Richard, and appreciate y'all being here tonight.
First, let me swap this around so it fits. Still not gonna.
And in between all that, he's had 8 kids.
Yep,
Is that all?
that's enough, thank you. Okay. Anybody heard of this thing called the Book of Mormon? All right. Why did I do this? Well, I get asked that every once in a while, and I don't have a legitimate good answer for it. I did it simply because I was interested, and it kind of got out of hand. as most projects do. So, I'm going to kind of walk you through the rationale, and you will see most of this that will show up in the book, which you can read and get it specifically. But you're also welcome to send me emails. I respond to email. That's the best way to do it. I may not be able to be Johnny on the spot with it, but I try to give it a genuine answer as we go along. So, we'll start with the very beginning. You have to remember what the Book of Mormon was like as a product, and we'll talk about the two kinds of books that are there. There's always two books. So on the one hand, there is the text, and we hear lots and lots and lots and lots about text. But on the other hand, there is the Book of Mormon, the book of the Book of Mormon. So there's a body and a spirit that's involved. I guess if you want to put it in the Latter-day Saint context, there's always two elements that have to be present before you have an actual book. So I'm going to leave the text mostly alone. That's not my interest. I dabble in printing history, and I'm fascinated with the change that happens in American printing and publishing between the 19th century and the late 20th century. And it happens that the Book of Mormon falls very nicely into that. And because it falls into that, there's some really interesting things that happen. We'll go through them as we go. So, the context for all of this is what it was like prior to 1920. So, if you look at the Book of Mormon from anything prior to 1920, you'll see a single column book, which was the way books have been printed for a very, very long time. Nothing surprising there. It had been divided into chapters and verses already about 25 years earlier by Orson Pratt. And it had become, at least the Latter-day Saint version, had become standard equipment. The one thing that people forget or don't know is that the Book of Mormon was not produced in Utah. It was produced elsewhere, and usually far afield elsewhere. Mostly in Chicago, because that's where the closest major publishing operations were in the United States. And Utah had been farming out major publications for a very long time. So yes, the Juvenile Instructor Office did some small-scale publishing, like the Faith Promoting Series, okay? Those are simple enough productions, they could do those in-house. But when you look at a case-bound book, almost all of those were farmed out. So the 1869 Book of Mormon was done in where? New York. Okay, was not done in Utah. It was done all in New York and shipped west. Actually, the Deseret Readers were done the same way. They were not produced in Utah. It carries a Utah imprint, but it's not done here in Utah. So by the mid 1870s, the church realized that they could, even if they had the equipment, they didn't want to invest in the kind of production that they had to have. You have to remember that the Latter-day Saints were a very, very small market when you looked at things. So there's no reason to have a major operation generating hundreds of books because people aren't buying them in that scale. So with the stuff that they do get done is comparatively small. Let me give you an example. So in the first edition of Jesus the Christ, 1915, right? September 1915, I think. Is that right? September 1915. I think that sticks in mind. September 1915, Deseret News Press generates the type, prints the book, and has it bound in New York because they don't have anywhere else to do it here. And then for the second edition, they say, we don't want to do it. Okay? Second edition of Jesus the Christ, which comes out about a month and a half later. Talmage actually goes back to New York and stays in the James Pott Company offices while they make a production. There's a First Presidency letter that says you can do it anywhere else as long as it's a faithful reproduction. In other words, they want a duplicate. So everything past the second edition and inclusive is produced in New York, not in Salt Lake City, even though it says Deseret News Press on it. Okay? So that gives you an example of what's going on. Zion's Printing and Publishing had begun, had been founded, in 1908, right?
1907.
7. I was off by a year.
October.
Okay. But they weren't really producing until later, though.
Correct, 1908.
Okay? And they're a printing house. They're not a bindery. So they're not even binding their own material. 1912, the Henry Eaton Company out of Chicago produces the latest, what would they call the large paper edition of the Book of Mormon, which is not all uncommon. It was a hardback edition. And for some reason, there were a couple of very minor typographic errors. There was like 2 words were transposed or something like that. But it set off a couple of folks who were very concerned. In 1915, March of 1915, Zion's Printing issues its own copy of the Book of Mormon. It's intended specifically for missionary work. And then it runs through, what, 8 or 10 editions. They call them editions. They're basically printings. However, there's at least one major reset that is explained in the book because there was kind of a puzzle involved in it. So I won't go into that one in detail, but it explains, I think, one of the complexities that book publication faced in the early 20th century. When you're talking about, when we're talking about printing and binding, you know, we have Signature publishes books, but you don't print them and you don't bind them. You contract that elsewhere. That wasn't any different than what had happened in the early 20th century. So, for several years, there is a problem, at least a perceived problem. Henry Eaton and Company is producing at least 2, probably 3 versions, sizes of the Book of Mormon for different markets. So, for instance, the Henry Eaton Company is marketing books to the Temple Square Information Center. Here we go, the Information Bureau, which is a different edition than the Deseret Sunday School edition, which is a different edition than the Deseret News version, which they're contracting over Deseret News title, which is different than a number of other things. Okay, so by the early 19th century, by 1915, by 1919, there's enough complexity and there's enough scattered stuff around that the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 are saying this isn't effective. Now remember what happens in 1918, right? What happens in 1918?
World War I and pneumonia.
World War I and pneumonia, but also Joseph F. Smith passes away and there's a new president of the church whose name is Heber Grant. And what's Grant's background?
Finance.
By finance and business. So you have a finance and business guy coming to the leadership of the church at a time where you have all kinds of complexities going on. One of the very first things that Grant does is he pulls in his expert on books. Oh, we got to that in a second. Okay. There's some other problems. I forgot. I got to remember this is up here. The Book of Mormon has some problems. The references which had been produced by Orson Pratt in the 1870s were all his work. And they didn't work very well. At least they weren't felt to have worked very well. There was the difference between English editions of the book, English as in British, and American editions of the book, which have different spellings. And remember that most copies of the Book of Mormon that come into Utah come from the British mission, so by the time they get here, they're not quite the same. And the British edition is produced from the 1837, not the corrected 1840, so there's other things that are going on that way. The structure, just the way that people speak and the orthography we use, the way we write things out has changed in the 25 years between 1879 and 50 years between 1879 and 1920 or so. Okay? Especially a Rough Rider cowboy who decides from the White House that American English, just needs to get rid of some of this English silliness. So he drops R-E and goes to E-R. He drops the U out of neighbor and other things like that and misses a few, and so we still have a few words that are spelled in the English fashion. And then there are a couple of errors. There were a couple of very, very minor errors, but they were there, and it grated on a number of sensibilities. So the First Presidency pulls together, well, it does a couple of things. Number one, the first thing that happens is Talmage is given a responsibility to create efficiencies in the church publishing, specifically in book selling. So he recommends in 1919 that the Deseret Book Company, the Deseret Book Company is founded by a consolidation and closing of the Deseret Sunday School Union and the other one, which I can't remember all of a sudden. Anyway, the Juvenile Instructor bookstore. So that we now have a single, honest-to-goodness, unified producer for church books. And they're hoping that it would eliminate some of the complexities and the duplication and the unnecessary duplication that's happening. So that's the first thing that happens. I think that sets off a bit of a snowball as they start looking for, okay, well, if that's the case, if we're going to do it, we may as well fix a few things. One of those is the edition of the Book of Mormon. By the end of 1919, the existing stocks of the book had basically been exhausted. They were not warehoused in Salt Lake, by the way. They were warehoused in Chicago. And there's a large file of papers in the First Presidency's office where people who buy copies, you can find the requests that have been forwarded on from Chicago. All right, so here's the Book of Mormon committee. 6 apostles are given the assignment to make some recommendations about the book. What do we do with this thing? Okay, so 18th of March 1920, the call goes out. They officially appointed. Okay, so for 10 points apiece, who are they?
Richard, Talmage, Smith, Whitney, Ballard, and Ivins.
Okay, so who's number 1?
George F. Richards.
That's George F. Richards. 2 is Joseph Fielding. Okay, 3 is
Whitney.
Whitney. Yeah, that's Orson Whitney. 4 is, yeah, that's Anthony Ivins, which is a strange appointment. Number 5 is Talmage, and number 6 is Melvin Ballard. Okay, so there you go. Now, if you look at that, that makes lots of sense. And the way things shake out are very different than what you'd expect. Often we hear of Joseph Fielding Smith. He is the church historian coming up here very quickly, but he's not heavily involved in this project. Not at all. In fact, I've been through his diaries. I can't find a single mention of anything that he actually did. Now, that's not all that unusual because he mostly didn't write about what he did in his day job. But March 18th, keep that date in mind. It makes some significance. Okay. What really happens is George F. Richards, who is the senior apostle, is headed up as the committee chair. But effectively, all of the day-to-day operations devolve to Talmage. Now, why Talmage? Well, his record of publication is unparalleled. He does everything. He's the one, you can see his list of stuff there. He had handled the Articles of Faith, which is a major publication. He had done some other publishing before that, too. He had personally handled the Pearl of Great Price revision that happens in 1900. He had proposed and was basically assigned the job of doing House of the Lord in 1911, made an apostle the same year. He does Jesus the Christ. He is the one who drafts the Father and the Son. You familiar with that one? That's a doctrinal statement that's made. And then he's the one who personally and individually handles the church's consolidation of its publishing and printing operation. And so he takes the lion's share of things. Fortunately, he was a diarist who actually did write what he did. So, in March and April of 1920, the 6 apostles go through, actually what they do is they get a whole box or crate or something like that of 1912 Eaton printings, which have the largest margins. They're large paper, so they've got margins that are about that wide as opposed to this wide. Gives them a little bit more writing space. And they sit down and individually read the entire Book of Mormon cover to cover and mark it up. Say, what do you think needs to change in this? Well, there was a bunch of things that happened. They did a front-to-back textual review, the whole thing. And it looks like this. This is the, as far as I can tell, and I'm sorry the images aren't the very best, this is the committee copy. Now, what happened, eventually when they all got back together, they handed around this one copy of the book, and they all marked in it the corrections that they saw based on the priorities that they had. If you look at the title page here, and I'll go into a couple of things, and it'd be fun if we get everybody up to really to look at it. What you'll see, can you see that well enough? Can you see the marks? There's a couple of hands in this book. Now, this is the committee copy, And I'm going to give you a test here, and you won't be able to see it, I'm afraid. It didn't work as well as I thought. There are 4 people who have written in this book, and I've been through absolutely every single page of this thing, trying to figure out who's done what. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to do it. So, there's another page. It's a little clearer. Can you see the 4? I can point them out for you. One of them is down here. Can you see what it says? Is it visible at all? It says between AD 400 and 421. Okay, there's the beginnings of your chronology. The chronology, we pick up the chronology actually probably from another source, but they've actually started penciling it in here. Okay? That's in green pencil. Number 2, that's this purple hand, and the purple hand actually exists in another copy of the book, which is an individual copy. That one is owned and is managed by the Church History Department. Brent Ashworth found that in the 1980s at Sam Weller's for $25. And it was just foul at that point, so he bought it and gave it back to the church after Sam had bound it in his famous black buckram. Okay? So this purple hand shows up in 2 copies. The third hand is this red pencil right here. This is, and when you compare the 2 copies side by side, you can absolutely see that the committee copy is collating marks, and that the person who was writing in the purple ink was after the person who had been writing in the red pencil, because the person in the red pencil had caught a couple of errors that also the purple ink did, but it was marked so he didn't have to mark it. Okay, so you can pretty much say this is the final version of what they had decided to make. This is not the fair copy, and that's part of the challenge. There's one other one that's hard to see, and that's over here. It's also red pencil, but it's kind of got a little brown in the pencil. So it's not the same red pencil. So clearly somebody is doing some work. It's not just been given to a secretary. They're actually marking themselves. They're taking the time to go through and mark it. I don't have the wherefore to figure out what's going on. Talmage puts together, drafts a letter to the First Presidency dated May 27th, 1920. And he says, here's what we're doing. We're going through, and he says some really important stuff. Number 1, they are thoroughly checking up all of the footnotes, all of the references, and they're making some decisions on it. Perfectly reasonable thing to do, right? Second thing they're going to do is they're going to have a new index. Now, you don't need an index unless you are doing a completely new edition. Okay? Because you can't have an index to the old edition put into a new book. So it has to, by this point they're deciding this has got to be a new book. John Mills is going to do that. Mills was a member of the Deseret Sunday School Union. He had been involved with the 1903 Pearl of Great Price thing and helped drive the pronunciation guide that later shows up in the Book of Mormon. It had been done by 1910. Now, importantly, it says the text is undergoing revision as to punctuation, capitalization, and orthography generally so as to make it fairly consistent in these respects throughout. Now, remember, punctuation was never in the Book of Mormon. Punctuation is just a convenience for reading and sensibility. So as things change from edition to edition, punctuation changes. And the way that English is punctuated had changed between the mid-Victorian period and between the early 20th century. And then it says at the bottom they're comparing editions. Now I would love to find out what they were comparing. There's a couple that I know, but I can only speculate on it, and I go into some more detail in the book to try and help you make some sense out of things. I think what they did, this is the first time they really got serious about comparing the early editions, early print editions, to the text that they wanted. What were the changes? Okay? I don't think that anybody really understood the difference between the 1837 and the 1840 by this generation. It had happened, but I'm not sure they understood it yet. Neither of the manuscripts were available, so they weren't considered at this point. They were present, but not in a condition for real study by any stretch. So, what does it look like? There were, as I look at it, they break into basically 7 groups of material. Some of it's very straightforward. They correct a little bit of grammar. That makes perfectly good sense. Sometimes there are some really weird constructions. To our modern evolving sensibilities. They changed the punctuation, and I'll let you read what that says there. They standardize spelling, and they decide specifically to use American English as opposed to English English. So they go back to a standard version of that. They standardize capitalization, and they rejoin words. Now remember, in the 19th century, it was very common to see breastplates and hill fort, those kind of things as two words. Now they simply make them back into a modern orthographic view of the way things are recorded. And then they change a whole bunch of chapter headings and runnings, which are really non-textual anyway. That's just for convenience. But the May 27th letter lays out 99 actual textual changes to the book. Now, they're not changing too much. They're just changing a word here or a word there, mostly for sense. We also don't have the second letter that I know was sent to catch the other half of the book. They had only gone through about half the book at this point. But that's what we have. So there were some changes, none of them drastic. However, it's significant because this marks the very first time that I can tell that the leading quorums of the church actually take back responsibility for the issuance of the Book of Mormon from people like mission presidents and from individual apostles and from businesses itself. They have decided what stands. As a matter of fact, there's these list of changes. Anthony Lund, who's a member of the First Presidency, says specifically, we will not discuss this, we will not vote on this because the president of the church isn't here and he's the only one who's authorized to make those changes. And he says it very bluntly. So they had to wait for a day or two before it went. Okay? So once they have a text or they have a marked up set of text, they have to take it to the next step. So if you're going to do a new book, that means you've got opportunities to do new things. What else needs to go into a book of Scripture besides just the text? We'll assume the verse structure stays together. What else? Well, there's the prefatory material. So rather than having not very much, they actually cull together a number of things, and they farm this out between apostles, and they do a number of things. So there's a table of contents. Now, the table of contents becomes a sacrificial lamb. Table of contents is the only thing I know for sure that Joseph Fielding Smith worked on. It's the only thing that I know he worked on. Unfortunately, well, we'll get to that. I'll show you later. Okay, the chapter summaries and headings for the 1978 revision, 79 or 1981 revision, was all done by Bruce McConkey, right? For the 1920 edition, they were done by Orson F. Whitney. That's one of the very few things, shows up in Whitney's diary. He says, I have spent my time working on what he called headlines. So they're basically the chapter summaries that are for that. Orson Whitney does that. And then fascinatingly, the apostles don't do the cross-references. They farm it off to one of their editors for the improvement era, a guy by the name of Janos Schoedel. Now, Schoedel is known as a scriptorian. He was not a theologian, but he was a scriptorian. He ran circles around Joseph Fielding Smith. But Smith was a theologian, and he had position. But Janos Schoedel is handed a copy of the Book of Mormon, and he's told to update and modernize a script. It's the only actual manuscript we have of the whole process is his list of references. We also have the index, so take it back, wasn't the only thing. He goes through, and then the apostles divide those out, and they go individually in pairs or trios, individually through every reference and decide, is it going to stand or is it not going to stand? And they did that in 2 months. Okay? The other thing is what goes in the back of the book. Now, the index obviously can't be done later because you have to have finished pages for that one. But they do decide to put in a pronouncing guide. And the pronouncing guide is lifted almost directly out of the 1910 edition of the Deseret Sunday School. Did I say 1903 before that? It was 1910. There had been a pronunciation guide developed for the Book of Mormon because there was, and they decided to add it to the Book of Mormon for that point. So, now what do? Well, you have a text, you have front and back matter, you have everything kind of ready to go. What do you have to have next in the process? How do you get these books? You've got to have some sort of a production house. Now that raises some interesting questions. Where do you find, now remember, this is the late 1919, 1920, Mormons are not highly regarded in the United States at this point. They're not going to go afield to find it, so what are you going to do? Where are you going to find these people? I think that they looked at probably a number of people. They certainly would have disqualified Eaton very quickly because Eaton had been responsible for the editions of the Book of Mormon that had errors in them, so obviously they're out of work. The Deseret News could perhaps have produced it, but they weren't really interested. They didn't even have a book plant at that point. They simply used the Deseret News presses to issue whatever books that they may have done during downtime. And they didn't have much of that. So they had to go further afield. So who do you ask? Well, you could have chosen Nashville. Nashville actually was the center of religious publishing in the United States. Nashville, Tennessee. The problem that Nashville, Tennessee is virulently anti-LDS. Okay? So we can maybe exclude that one. They eventually, they probably took a look at James Pott because James Pott Company out of New York had been the company that had worked with Talmage on Jesus the Christ. I know he went to what's called the Zincograph Company. They were ones who did mostly plates, but they could do production. But I really think that he knew that he wanted to go to look at what was then one of the largest printers in the country, and that is the W.B. Conkey Company out of Hammond, Indiana, which had moved out of Chicago. Started Chicago in the 1870s, moved out of Hammond to avoid labor issues, and set up what at the time was the largest printing plant in the world. And by the time that the Latter-day Saints come knocking, it's no longer the largest, but it's certainly probably the most efficient and certainly the most thorough. It was claimed, and probably accurately, that if they could be given the printing plates, the finished printing plates, in 24 hours they could have 10,000 copies of a book printed, bound, and in the buyer's hands in 24 hours. Okay? It was remarkable. Now you have to think, this is a big plant, and I'll show you some interior views, I think, of this. They could do it. It was remarkable. Eventually, Talmage signs a publication agreement, a printing agreement. They're going to typeset the Book of Mormon. They're going to produce 4 sets of proof. They're going to generate the binding. And, well, we'll get to that in a second. They start off by the easy stuff. You have to deal with the typesetting first. So, now remember, this is not the ages of the internet. You can't just email somebody, but you can put them on a train and ship them back and forth, and that's what ends up happening. In September, Talmage goes to Hammond and he sets up the proofs. He stays with the mission office in Chicago, and then he comes back and rides the train back 40 miles in and out of downtown Chicago. And he takes care of setting things up and letting go. In a matter of a couple of days, working probably 24 hours a day, the Conkey Company was already well into setting type. They went like lightning. You will see a couple of prints in the book that I found. Those are the intertype machines, very likely, that set the type for the Book of Mormon. Now, I don't know if I'm sure they did it on more than one typesetting machine, which means they had to have different sets of mats to fit the machine. They have different sets of exactly the same typeface to set that up. Okay? So they've got to do proofreading. That has to come back and forth to Salt Lake. The church does not trust Conkey's proofreaders to do any of the work. They're going to do it themselves. And then there has to be page makeup. You have to break everything. Then you have to do the imposition and get it out. So let me start moving fast. Whoops. Let's focus first on typesetting. Now, what does typesetting look like in the 1920s? Well, in the original Book of Mormon, you had what's called a news and book font. And a news and book font was a whole bunch of foundry type, little tiny pieces of type that you have to line up character by character, space by space. Tens of thousands of these things that make up pages, and they fit into a double case. Now, we've moved past that point. They don't use foundry type. By the way, do you know why we have uppercase and lowercase letters? because they're in the difference of it in news and book font. That is literally the reason. Okay, where's what they have instead. They have, this is a Linotype Model 4. They were, Conkey Company, I found out only after the book was finished. They were running Intertype machines, which are very close cousins. But this is a Model 4 illustration showing the typesetter. The guy holding the magazine is going to drop this on top here. Now the Model 4 was a single magazine unit. There are other Linotype models that you could do 2, 3, or 4 magazines, and you would have to manually crank them up and down. What's marvelous about this thing, and I have seen these work, they have a single rotating camshaft, and every action of the machine comes off of that in some fashion. It is poetic engineering. It is I think it's the most incredible mechanical device ever built. But you have to hit the key every time. That drops a little brass mat that looks kind of like this. It looks exactly like this. Directly down, and it lines up, and then it has these thick spacing, what they call spacing bands, that are inserted automatically. That justifies the line, and then it puts it up against the casting head. It spits 610 degree molten type metal against there. It holds it for about 3 seconds. By that time the lead is hardened. It drops it out. The mats go back, are automatically coated across the top, spit into the magazine, they fall back down by gravity. It's poetry in motion. So this is what they had to do. If you find a typographic error on a line, you have to recast the entire line. So a good typesetter is worth his weight in gold, because that means you don't have to reset the lines. But that means there's tens of thousands of these things, the column width, that have to be typeset. Right? So that's what typesetting looks like. Then eventually, okay, that leads to errors, right? Everybody knows about the 1920 error, right? Where can you see? Can you see it there? There. Okay. Can you see that yellow?
Mm-hmm.
It's okay. Okay. There's the error. One doggone missed error in the Book of Mormon type. Now, we'll get to printing in just a second. The Book of Mormon was not produced from type. It was produced from electrotype, and that is significant. But the fun thing is, there are 2 more errors in the Book of Mormon that most people don't know about. One of them is, can you see it in here? Well, you can, I know. What is it? Can you see it?
Spelled wrong.
Yeah, they have a capital I rather than a 1. Okay, picky, 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 picky. Yeah, that's what you do when you're a proofreader. Okay, there's one other one. One of these things is not like the other. It's right here. Okay? Now, interestingly enough, this one was caught, it went through 2 editions, or 2 printings, and it shows up in every one of them. Okay? This one wasn't caught until 1927. This one wasn't caught and corrected until 2012. Okay? It was carried through 2 more editions. It was not corrected until the 2013 reset of the Book of Mormon.
What is it, the hyphen in today?
Yes, that's the old way that today was spelled during the 19th century. And they corrected it everywhere else. I went back to the manuscript. They missed it in proofreading when they were correcting in the books. Because it wasn't marked, it was never marked in proof, it was never corrected, it was simply passed forward. And of course, the church was fanatically careful about the scriptures when they went later on down the road. So it was simply maintained, and nobody questioned it until 2012, when it got produced. So that's kind of fun. Wow. Okay, there are also type anomalies. Yeah, Gene.
Did the production of the Our Lady's Church catch it?
They never had it.
I have never compared the 2. I don't know if
I'm
they
gonna look.
worried about it. I think they made the correction, just didn't worry. That's my guess.
Yeah.
Okay, type anomalies. Now, remember, this is a mechanical process, so it can shift and change a little bit. There are 2 type anomalies on these pages, and there are probably more, but these are the ones that I know I'm going to point out. Okay? One of them, and it's a line justification thing. Now remember, this is a brass thing sliding down into place, squeezed with bands subbed in it to tighten it further, and then pushed up against to be cast. Once it's cast, it can't change. It doesn't change. Now I don't know if this was done in a correction or whether it was done in original typesetting. There's no way to find out. But I thought I'd done that.
And it came to pass.
Nope, it's not. It came to pass. Oh, there it is. I can't see it on this one. Can you see it here? Yeah.
The S is up.
The S descends just slightly on one of the pages. It's the only place in the Book of Mormon that I know of that happens. There's also one, you can see it in the folio of 513. You can see where the 3 has not base aligned with the 1. It's not a typographical error, it's just something that's different. Okay? So when people say, how do you know this 1927 book wasn't a super rare redone? Well, because if they have that, it can't be anything else. It can't be anything else. All right, so there's that. So now let's talk about makeup and printing. This is where things get fun. We all use Word these days. You say print and it simply prints and it's just happy, right? Most of the time. It doesn't work that way. When you are running letterpress, you have to have, or everybody has to have, an imposition. An imposition is the way that you lay out, and you can do this automatically these days, but back in the day, you actually had to take type and you had to lay it in place and lock it up in the press in a way that when you folded the sheet, it would back up and fold properly. That's just the way it worked. Oh, let me back up and say one thing. Since I said the Book of Mormon wasn't printed from type, what was it printed from? Electrotype plates. An electrotype plate is an electrochemical deposit of copper on the surface of the thing. And then you can back it, you can make any number of copper shells, what they call shells, and you backfill them with type metal. Then you have a copper face that's a nice, crisp, clear, and very sturdy impression. So Conkey makes 2 sets, and the contract calls for 2 sets of electrotype plates. Okay? Those are an absolute duplicate of each other. They can't be different because they are made from the same setting of type. Then the type goes away and gets melted down, and you work with the plates. Okay? So they're setting up plates in an imposition like this. The blue one on top is the back or the inner form. The front is the outer form. Now the important thing is the position for number 1, okay, for the first page in whatever you're printing. That's going to show up always by practice in the lower, if you're looking at a press, it goes flat like this or it goes down like this. It always goes in the lower right hand position. That's always the way it sets up. The lowest numbered page of the outer form always goes in that position. That means everything else lays out this way. The 1920 Book of Mormon was, after they signed the contract, Talmage comes back and says, wait a second, as long as we're doing a whole bunch of missionary stuff, we may as well do some better quality ones. So they do actually 2 runs, 2 press runs. The first press run they do is done octavo. Okay, it means that they take this parent sheet of, I forgot to bring the sheet, and I'd show you how big it is. They take this parent sheet of paper, they cut it in half, and then each one of those is a separate signature. And you can look in these as he's got it up in the case right here and see how that fits. Okay? So they do about 10,000 copies, a little bit more than that, about 11,000 copies of this better quality, library quality paper. Okay? Then they decide, Conkey said, wait a second, if you're going to cut 10,000 copies, if you're going to cut them in half, you're going to take some real staff time to do all of that cutting, even though they're going to do it on a big guillotine cutter. So there's an easier way to do this, and that's going from an octavo imposition to a 16mo or a sextodecimo imposition. Now, look at the difference. Are they the same? Are the positions the same? Look at number 17.
13.
Okay? Number 1 is still in the same position. Number 17 is the lowest numbered page on the second on the second sheet. But now when they move from an octavo to an to a sextodecimo, you can't just put them together. You actually have to reimpose the plates. And I would never do that. I would be a lousy pressman. 17 has moved from this position to this position, and it's changed direction. Okay? This is the imposition that had run the library quality edition. This is the imposition that ran the missionary edition. They are not the same. They are not the same. They're not the same printing. They're exactly the same type, but not the same printing. Okay, so here's an example. That will give you, if you were, they were running what's called a medium format press. This is a large format press. This would have been the size of the press bed that they were using to print the Book of Mormon. It was not on large machines. It was not on a web press where they're running big stuff. Okay, now the church thought they were doing quite a bit by having 50,000 copies of the missionary edition printed. They thought this was enormous. Hammond did that all the time. They were the ones that print the Sears catalog, okay, where they print millions of copies. That's where they would use their web press stuff. Not at this. This is too small. So it's quite possible, because of the way they ran, that the front of some sheets could have been printed on one machine, and then 3 days later the reverse of the other side, the outer forms could have been, or the inner forms could have been printed someplace else in the plant. So we're not looking at exactly the same machine doing the same thing over and over and over again. Let's talk about binding a little bit. The church realized that if you're going to produce a new edition of the missionary edition, you might as well give the folks at home the same thing. Now they're willing to pay a little bit more, so they do. And they set up an arrangement where they decide to put together 4 different bindings of the library edition page, the better quality paper, and then 1 edition with lots and lots and lots of copies of this missionary edition. And that's the one that they're going to give out. Okay? Talmage, because there are so many overs to the press run, he says, okay, do me a favor, take 50 copies of those, and I will pay you myself, and do it that way. So I don't have that one up here, because those are awfully hard to get together with all the rest of them. Okay? Talmage puts it together, and this one is his presentation copy to President Grant himself, and it says Christmastide. That's because Talmage comes back with the first 4 examples of the first 4 bindings on the 22nd of December 1920. Okay? He had been given those on the 18th day of December. Okay? Now I told you, remember, to keep in that mind that other one, that other date. They did this entire process in 9 months, to the day. Okay? That is pretty incredible. When you think about how much work went into it, it was a 9-month process. Now, when they did the 1981 edition, it took a little more than 9 months. In fact, it took a lot more than 9 months. Delivery and binding, the books actually didn't start arriving until the 28th of December. They weren't in Salt Lake until the 28th of December, so it's technically a 1921 book, but it's all dated 1920. Deseret Book, the new Deseret Book Company, produced a bazoodle of flyers that went out, and you can see the various bindings that are there. I don't know how it was distributed. I do know that most of the traffic that was sold through Deseret Book was not foot traffic in and out the doors. It was mostly mail order. In fact, British booksellers were stunned that most Americans that bought books bought them through the mail. And I've got good documentation on that. Okay? So, once you have 5 books, you call them books and you start distributing them. Let's talk about what happens after, because that's just as interesting a story. New edition, after they finish the production of the Book of Mormon, in March 1921, the First Presidency comes back and says, look, as long as we've gotten the Book of Mormon done, as long as we got the Pearl of Great Price done, we may as well do a new edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. So they appoint a committee of 6 apostles that goes through it, and the first meeting, the very first meeting, 5 of the 6 apostles says, "You the man." And And Talmage is appointed as a committee of one to handle the Doctrine and Covenants revision entirely. So when you think about it, James E. Talmage is responsible for about 3/4 of the scriptures that we have in use today. He was also involved in a side story that you'll find in an appendix in this book about the Bible and how we ended up with the Cambridge edition Bible and why it's significant for the way it works too. Okay? So there's a new edition in 1921. That's because there's a new edition of the Book of Doctrine and Covenants. That means we now have enough that we can put together this new idea called the triple combination. Now, it was not really new. The British saints had had one for 20 years, but the Americans had not. So the first triple combination that's disseminated here is a production of the Conkey Company in their binding and in their printing. It looks essentially the same, or it's similar to the triple combination that's been produced in Europe, but it's not. It's got all of the other stuff that goes with it, and I'm skipping lots and lots of stuff, so you don't have to stay here all night. Okay. Conkey is the one who handles reprints of the book periodically. They do it in 1924. They do it, and then there's some problems. There is some problems. By this point, Heber Grant's half-brother, Ben McConkey, is tapped as the head of a new book organization called the Deseret News Press, and they had separated it. They built a new plant in 1921 up on West Temple and about 6 or 7 south. And they start book publishing. Well, what do you do when you're a new manager? You want to make sure you have a product to produce. And there's 2 sets of these plates. One of them is still producing books in Chicago periodically. And Deseret News says, well, we can do that. Why are we paying somebody out in the hinterlands to do this? Well, that sets up a problem, because by this point, by having a new edition of the book, you consolidate production. So all of a sudden, the pocket edition that had been a moneymaker for the Deseret News is no longer being produced because it's the old book. The editions that the missionary editions that had been the mainstay for Zion's printing were no longer being sold, so they're hurting. And so they basically go to the presiding bishop's office, who now has charge of the thing, and they say, what's the skinny? We should be able to do this. Why are we farming out church production, ministering production to foreigners, the great unwashed? There is eventually, and that's what happens. They divide up the territory. So Zion's printing is given the responsibility in 1927 to generate all missionary editions of the Book of Mormon. And Deseret News Company is the one who is given the responsibility, the right or the privilege of making shekels off of the scriptures that are sold to the Latter-day Saints. Seems reasonable until they try to poach on each other's territory, and you can read that by yourself. At some point, however, because this is the 20th century, there's a move that's made in technology from letterpress printing, where you're actually squeezing something in a press, to offset, which can work very much more quickly using grain zinc plates. And both sets of plates now, well, before we get to that point, so we have, interestingly enough, the same edition of the book being produced in 2 locations, one in Salt Lake and one in Independence, Missouri. So which is the edition? How do you define that? That's the challenge. Then there's the move to offset. 1942, at least by 1942, the churches invested in a new group of printing presses and entirely different printing technology. And they produced a photo-reduced edition for the LDS servicemen. Only Americans, interestingly enough, not the British, which is kind of curious. And they run, I'm guessing, probably 30,000 copies of that, because there was about 20,000 LDS servicemen. And that became the tradition that you still see today, that you can order for the LDS servicemen's or for the servicemen's edition of the scriptures. And then what else happens? Let's see. The problem with the The problem with the move to moving technology from letterpress to offset is that you're no longer running actual plates. You hold on to the plates because that's your master copy. But you produce what's called a slick. And most people have never seen a slick. A slick is done on a very special kind of paper. It's never sold to anybody except for printers, and it takes a very clean, very good impression. Then you photograph that, you use the negative, you strip that into pieces, and you produce the printing plate from that. And the challenge there is you have to make some sense out of the way this works if you're the pressman. So that's where you start seeing they had used signings, and we'll get to those in just a second. They use signings, but then they complicate matters. By this point, Deseret News is starting to produce things, but I actually have a couple of letters written to Talmage, very blunt letters about the capacity of the Deseret News printing office. Now, this is not the one that Thomas Monson was running. This was earlier, and it was not complimentary. They weren't capable of doing the work that they thought they could. You can see that partly by the press signings that show up at the end of the book. You can see there's 4 different ones there, and so there's very little consistency. Now they have to produce the book, and that's not the problem. But they aren't consistent in the way that they do it. Okay, so for instance, you can see the one on the top has this is a second signature signing, and they've moved. In this case, this is before they moved to offset. They're running slugs for number 2 for second signing. This one's in May 1921. This one's in December 1920I. Again, it's an issue thing that's having a problem. And just in case you're interested, there's some oversewing on the top image you can show. All of this gets explained in the book in a lot more detail. I'm trying to just show you. Okay, so if you've got a signing, you can see the signing over here, this 14. You'll notice that's in a very different position than the other 2. What's happened? Well, somebody had actually changed the signings in the plates. And then it gets even more complicated when you add 2 signings. So you have one in this case that says 17. That's the one that was done with Conkey's original plates, but in the meantime, Deseret has added a new signing for 27. So you get double signings for things. Just one more bit of complication to work with. Or you can have the same book that has 2 different signings. So there's a couple of examples, 135 and 118, and yet it's exactly the same page. It depends on how you're printing the thing. On top of that, then you get to something that I can't explain really well, but I think is probably a binding code. My suspicion is that they probably, in order to maintain economies of scale with printing, they would batch print all kinds of stuff and then let it sit. And then Deseret News or Deseret Book Company would say, we need 500 more copies of the triple combination, or we need 500 copies of this. And so they would simply bind them up, but the binder would stamp it. In order to keep themselves straight, they would stamp them with some sort of a code. Now, I'm fairly sure that the 2 digits at the end are year dates. I can't explain the letters in the front because they don't match up with what I know or what I think I know about the printing. So you show up with an M, you see an S. There's bunches of other letters that show up, an N occasionally, a C. I don't know. It could be the bindery. It could be the date. It could be half a dozen other things. I'm not quite certain. But again, this gives you an idea. As you put all this together, you get an idea of what's happening with the scriptures and how they're disseminated. Okay, so finally, things get to the point, and then I will argue and defend that in 1947, 1948, there is a new edition of the scriptures. How can you tell? Well, because there's a new copyright date that's added on the back of the title page, and it says copyright Heber J. Grant, 1948. Or George Albert Smith, not Grant. Okay. Now, why? Let's work through this one. There's new copyright information for sure. Any book with a 1948 copyright is not and cannot be a 1920 edition Book of Mormon. It's just not the same. Why can I tell that? Well, there's bindings to start with. There are some complications, you can read about it, and I think I can explain it. I'm not positive, but I think I can explain it. If you see a 1920 edition of the book in that kind of a binding, you've got an anomaly. It's a special kind of anomaly, and it's described in there, so pay attention to what's there. So, how can we tell that the 1948 edition is not the same as the 1920 edition? How can we say that they're different? Let's take a look. Okay? Here are two of the same pages out of the different edition. There's the 1920 edition on the left, there's the 1948 edition on the right. Now I don't expect you to be able to see this, but there, for somebody who is picky and somebody who's a type guy, there are some very clear differences. Can you see anything there? Da, 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 da. What do you think, Lloyd?
Well, on the first column, the very first verse, whatever, one of them ends with a little orphan there at the end. The other one's got 2 words at the end.
Okay, well, you caught the one, so that's one. And we'll get to that one in
How
just a
much did you
second.
wager?
All right, let me walk you through it. One difference is that the footnotes have been reset. I'm going to move this. I keep hitting it. The footnotes have been reset. They've moved from a 5-point type to probably a 5.5-point type. Now that's picky little, but you know what? It's different type, so it can't be the same edition. The other thing that I know is if you look at the folios, if you look at the page numbers, they're not in the same font. If they're not in the same font, it can't be the same book because they're produced from electrotype plates. Now, let's get a little closer here. There are some other things that are very significant. Number one is that they've added about 4 points of space, so it makes a for sure full 36 pica depth on the page. Basically, they added 3/32 of an inch to make sure they had a full pica depth on the way that it runs. Okay, so that's one thing. And it's consistent through the 1948 books. Okay? There is a difference. Remember, it's a single plate. You can't just stretch it a little bit to get that extra space. It has to be something separate. Okay? There's also the line end on this page, and Lloyd caught it. There is a break. Do you see the break? In line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You go over here. See this? Is that up here? Nope. Okay. So there are occasional, they made a very careful duplication of the page, but it wasn't a flawless duplication, and so there is a few typographical differences. Remember, the 1928 produced from electrotype plates, you can't change the plate. It is fixed for all time. Something else, if you look carefully, you can see that the lines don't exactly base align the same way. It's a printing plate. If it was the same, it would be the same. It isn't the same, so it can't be the same plates. Right, this is down a little bit lower on the page. That's the same kind of thing. You can see that they don't base align the same way. An easy one to see is right here, is WIL and lands. Here they're base aligned in the 1920 edition. Here they're up by about 2 points of space. Just a very picky small difference. But that's what typographers look for, and that makes a difference. Okay? There's also a line break difference. So there's at least 2 typographical, hard typographical, 3 because you count the page footnotes. Okay? It's not the same edition. It can't be the same edition. Here's what's kind of fun. If you take a look at this, you can't see really carefully, but you have to align vertically. Look at it this direction. You can see that there are very slight differences in the way that those periods fall at line ends between the 2 editions. You can't stretch the plates. They are not the same edition. So that's how I know. We know that they were produced from new type. And the new type, I happen to know, was set by University Press out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Not Harvard University Press, not Harvard. But there's a very complicated story that goes along with that. It was a commercial typesetting firm, printing firm in Massachusetts, they contracted it out too. So once again, it was taken out of the hands of the Latter-day Saints and given to a foreign firm, and then recaptured. Once they had produced the type, then I think the rest of the printing was done locally. So we know for sure it is absolutely not the same edition as the 1948. The paper change lays out. They made a real careful attempt to duplicate type, but in the process, because the type is not exactly the same, it creates some bad typography. And when you know what to look for, you can see it. You can go through the appendix of the book, it'll give you the whole thing in there. So why did they do it? They didn't make any changes that anybody can really identify. They've already gone through the whole production effect once in 1920. Why do they reset the book? Anybody want to take a stab? The key is 27 years between 1920 and 1947. What happens?
Copyright?
Copyright, they need to reassert the copyright claim.
Yep. The copyright law in the United States at the time was 27 years with a renewable option. So they couldn't renew it on nothing, and so they had to have a change. Well, they're not going to change the text because they did that. They're not going to change the layout because they want to replicate what they've got, so it's not a break. So why do it? It's because of copyright. They're playing a game. And believe me, the church is not the only one that is playing this game. The text of the book is already in public domain. There's no copyright that can be claimed on it. But when you look at the copyright registration in 1948, it says copyright on new material. There's new material. There's no new material except a new setting. So they went to the expense of typesetting a new edition for the acceptable facade that it was a new edition. And that's why we have another one. By the way, another 27 years would put it up to about 1979, 1980, 1981. That's why, one of the reasons why there is a major new edition of the book in 1981. Right? So what? So what did we learn? Well, we learned a bunch of things. There's some really significant things, really significant things about the 1920 Book of Mormon. It's the first time that the First Presidency and the Quorum held retake control of the Scriptures from what had happened as it was scattered out during the 19th century, and responsibility for that. So that's a significant thing. It's one of the first steps in what we later call correlation. It's some sort of centrality for this thing called Scripture that is supposed to be standard, and it has not been very standard for a very long time. I think there's other stories to be told. I'm not going to tell the 1948 story. There's too many to go with that one, and there's not enough documentation. But that gives you an idea of why I spent way too much time writing this book, and why it's so much fun, because there are so many puzzle pieces scattered around to put together and give us an idea of the 1920 edition of the Book of Mormon. So that's it. So what can you ask?
Yeah, any questions here?
Go ahead.
So, did you say that the 1920 is the first time that it's in 2 columns?
Yes,
So, who designed it?
Conkey did.
So the printer,
The printer did
Designed it.
did the book design.
so they chose the typeface and all that stuff?
Well, it was approved by the church. And Talmage, if you go back through Talmage's diary, he makes several trips back and forth. He's actually released from responsibility in state conferences to take care of this process. So he makes trips back and forth. Right at before they before they sign the contract, he actually makes a few minor type decisions that change the book. But the major decision to go to 2-column, I think, was probably recommended by Conkey. That's the way the Bible had been set for decades, well, centuries at that point. And you use a short reading line because you can read faster than you can by going all the way across the page. So they're making it consistent with biblical scripture. So when you see 2 columns, you automatically think, okay, this is something different than the local novel. Yep.
I don't know how accurate this is, but I remember my dad telling me that when Wood published Joseph Smith Begins His Work, reprinting of the first edition of the Book of Mormon, that President Joseph, or Elder Joseph Fielding Smith, opposed that and didn't want it to be sold on a Deseret book. If that's true, how much of that is based on because of this proto-correlation experience with the 1920 edition of the Book of Mormon?
I think it's probably has not directly related to this. I think it's much more about Joseph Fielding than anything else. Joseph Fielding Smith, was somebody who looked at authoritative pronouncements as truth, and you don't mess with truth. And what the first edition of Book of Mormon did was complicate the story, and he didn't like complications. He really didn't like complications. The one thing that he complains about over and over and over again is this higher criticism where you get out of the meaning of a text and you start looking at the text as a document. Didn't like that. He wasn't comfortable with it. I think that was one of the reasons, I think probably the major reason, if he opposed it, that why he did so. It may have had something to do with this. I don't think so, but I can't say for sure. I don't know. Gene?
One thing you didn't mention, but as part of the complication, is when there was bindings left over.
Right. Yep.
Like
The
at
church is
Zion's.
cheap, right? At that point, especially because they're coming out of, the early 19th or the early 20th century, where they didn't have an awful lot of money, and so they decide rather than just getting rid of all the standing orders of the Book of Mormon, they seem to have shipped them to Salt Lake City and bound them in whatever fabric they had left. And you'll see a photograph in the book of the ones that I put together that I can say, these are done at the same time. Some of them were just the library copy, the good quality paper that was trimmed down into smaller size and shoved in between it. But because it's fatter, you look like a book that has been stretched between its covers. The spine literally doesn't fit. Yeah, you're right.
You see sometimes what's typically a Zion's printing cover
Yep.
shows up on Deseret Book as
Yeah.
an example.
And they used the new design, but they used the old fabric. So they used whatever black fabric they were just finishing out. So there's some real complications to it, yes, absolutely. What else? Gary?
So it's interesting to find out that Talmage was so involved with the Doctrine and Covenants, because that helps to explain his interest in experimenting with Latter-day Revelation.
Yes. And it happens almost exactly 10 years after his responsibility for the document for the D&C in 1921. And he handles it completely. He does everything. The other apostles don't quite wash their hands of the process, but they make him the guy who handles it all.
Maybe because they didn't want to do it.
Possibly. It's a lot of work, there's no question. And you're dealing with really picky details. And if you're not a detail guy, or if you're not much of a reader like Anthony Ivins, then you can push it off on somebody else and let them do it. Especially when they're good at it. Anything else?
The reference material, you mentioned there was a committee that
Yes.
prepared that. Did you find any debates or discussion about what should be included?
I put everything that I could find into the book. Part of what I didn't talk about here was when they got the thing printed, it got ready to print. You remember, well, you maybe don't know this. You always print the front material of the book last. Always. That's the last thing. Well, they got to the end of the print run, and they found out that their book was running short. Or actually, it was running long. It was running long. So what are you going to cut out of it? Text to scripture. You can't cut anything out except the front matter. So Talmage spends a couple of very hair-tearing days in Chicago, and this beautiful, long, carefully compiled table of contents gets chopped to book titles because they had to make up 2 pages. They had to make, well, you can't cut out the index, right? I mean, you can't cut out the index. You can't cut out the text, and that's basically the whole book. So the front matter gets severely cut back, and he does it all himself.
Wow.
And that's the form that it stays until, well, all of us went to seminary and whatnot. Those are the kind of things that we would have seen.
And that was Joseph Fielding Smith's contribution?
Yeah. And the committee chair, George F. Richards. Yeah. And
How long is the copyright good for now? You said it was 27 years. Is it the same now?
no, now it's been changed. The 1996 revision, the 1977 revision was a major change. That put it to a long ways, and then the 1996 copyright revision put it to 110 years without extension.
Oh,
So could they hold on to? Yeah, they could. They've still made some changes. If you've looked at the current edition in Deseret Book, you'll see that they have moved the position of some of the stuff. So for instance, the index, I can't remember the index, no, the topical guide in the Bible is now behind the Bible dictionary. Anyway, they moved it around between the 1979 and the 2012 edition. There will be changes. There will always be changes because people understandings change, facts and evidence change. Those kind of things will always be done. And if the church is going to hold copyright to the book, the text is out of copyright. There's no way they can control that. But the notes are not, and that is something that they can hold on to. So, Gene?
Just one other quick question. When Peterson leaves his position with the newspaper and becomes an apostle, you see some direct changes immediately in terms of Zion's printing for sure.
Yeah. Zion's printing eventually disappears.
1951.
1951. By that, you're in the post-war period. There is at least a couple of volumes of the triple combination, I am almost certain, were printed in England and shipped to the United States by Cambridge University Press, because they were really experts in printing, and they did it all the time. They've been doing it for 500 years. And then happens World War II, which slightly interrupts a few things, and so that printing comes back to the United States, because even though it was cheaper to print and distribute in Britain, you had to have plates in Britain at that point. You couldn't import books, so they couldn't use a new edition from the United States in Britain, but they could send a set of plates to Britain, produce it there, and go forward from there. And as long as you've got repros, as long as you've got slicks to work from, you can produce new letterpress plates. You just simply do it with photolithography. And you can do it with, Debizet did it. What is it? I'm racking my brain. Anyway, they can produce letterpress type from repros. It's a fascinating study. You see both technology change as well as interest in Scripture, but it's all tied up in this thing called the book. And the book is a fascinating thing. One of the things that I've been working on for a while is a similar study of No Man Knows My History, which is fascinating because it's one of the few books that has not been out of print since it was published in 1945. So it breaks across all of the changes from letterpress and halftone images all the way to the modern period, where you're dealing with digital offset. That's a fascinating study. Greg?
If I want to collect all the triples that come from the 1920 edition, how much shelf space should I allocate?
More than you have now. You may as well point out, we're going to do an extension of the book because Greg's already come up with, what, 24 more?
No, it's only 8.
Is it only 8? Okay.
Yeah.
But, as soon as you print something that's definitive, it's suddenly not definitive because you find other complications. That's just the way that works. But, yeah, it's time for an update, and we've been out less than 6 months. I didn't find the 116 pages, though. I kept looking and I couldn't find it.
That's in a different book we published.
Okay, gotcha. Anything else? Have I tired you out? Probably.
No.
Okay, my wife is nodding. Yes. She's telling me to sit down. All right, well, thank you. I'll hang around for a while if you want to ask any official questions.